But let me give you a brief bio for Darin while he catches his breath. Darin is the author of the best-selling novels Chang and Ang, The Real McCoy, and More Than It Hurts. And also the fantastic memoir, which we talked a little bit about, Half a Life, which was the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. And also the best-selling comic book series, Olivia Twist. He has won every single possible award you could possibly win. His books have been best books of the year in every single newspaper you've ever heard of. And he is one of my all-time favorite writers, as I told you guys before. So I have to tell you, Darin, I told the embarrassing story of when I went up and met you and told you all about my Nana.
Yes.
To the audience. But I mean, this is the truth, is that Darin was a significant part of our family for like the last 10 years of my Nana's life, because she carried Chang and Ang with her wherever she went and didn't remember reading it.
I forgot that part.
Which is a nice change. But so welcome, Darin, and thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm sure whatever has happened to you has been a trial.
I'm so sorry. I just got the time change wrong in my head. I'm just an idiot. So I'm so sorry. I'm so stupid, and I'm so embarrassed, and I feel bad. And whatever prizes I won, it was not punctuality. So please forgive me.
Well, you got nothing to worry about. And we're recording this, so anyone that signed up that didn't get to come, they're going to get an email when it goes up, so they're going to get to hear it. So welcome to Arts and Letters at UCR Palm Desert. Darin, it's nice to see you, and also just so nice to see you anyway, because you're my friend.
Yeah, I love seeing you, and I'm sorry I put you in a tough spot.
It's all right. And ladies and gentlemen, quick round of applause for Maggie Downs. Ladies and gentlemen, for joining me to pretend to be Darin for a little while. You're welcome, Maggie. So we're going to talk a little bit about your life. And of course, we're going to talk a lot about your brand new book, Queen of Tuesday. The first thing I have to know, of course, is, as a writer, when you're writing a book like Queen of Tuesday, and you're putting yourself in, you're putting your family in, you're putting real people in, when you sit down to work, how much fear do you have typing words just in general?
A lot, again, nothing compared to the fear that I felt when I realized I was late and I was running here, but a lot of fear, So can I swear in this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So I was a little nervous. So I'll give a quick summary of the book. So the book is, although maybe you did this in the interminable period when I wasn't around, but the book is a story of my grandfather and his life, and it's a family memoir, and it's the story of Lucille Ball and her kind of golden period, and then it's the affair, the passionate sexual affair that I invented for them. And so I told my dad, I said, I'm going to write a book about your father and Lucille Ball and their love affair, and be aware that they actually never had a love affair.
Right.
And no one in my family knew Lucille Ball. There's a chance that they were at a party together once, thrown by Trump's dad, which I'll get into in a second. But so there was no real connection with my family and Lucille Ball. And my dad said, "Wait a second, you're going to do a story of Papa sleeping with Lucille Ball?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "That's impossible." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Uncle Harold was fucking her." So he had a sense of humor about it. But it was a weird choice for a book, but I really wanted to talk about Lucille Ball, and I just thought she was the coolest person, and this was the way I figured out how to do it. Actually, I had a dream about my grandfather and Lucille Ball, and I couldn't figure out what the dream meant. And then I started digging, and I found out they both had been at this party thrown by Donald Trump's father, where Trump's dad bought all this land in Coney Island in New York City, where there was a really beautiful historic amusement park, the first amusement park in the world by some measures, and beautiful landmark building. And so, of course, Trump's dad decided to destroy it and just tear it down and build crappy housing. And the idea of Trump's father taking something beautiful and using celebrities to destroy it. So Trump's dad figured the way I can get around the criticism of destroying this landmark was I'll invite celebrities to this party, and at the stroke of midnight, they'll all throw a brick through this glass and steel structure, and everyone will say, "Oh, that's so glamorous." So that really happened, and what a cool opening for a book. But this was before Trump even. I mean, I wrote this book. It's taken me a while to write this book, unfortunately. So I started writing it before Trump had even announced, right before he announced.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought that's a cool opening. And then as Trump became a viable candidate for president and then president, I realized, oh, that's a much more resonant opening than I had thought of. So I got really lucky, actually.
Right. Well, your entire career, and this is including your nonfiction, though, has been sort of an anthropological examination of history. Every book that you have written has taken something true and delved fictionally into it, of course. And that's true of, beginning with Chang and Eng all the way up to this book, but also with your memoir, Half a Life, where you dig into your own life and you dig into your own experiences. So I'm curious, when you were a younger person, was there something that you like to read or something you like to do that sort of presaged your creative desires to go back and dig things up like this?
I don't think so. I just always liked history. It's funny. I studied with E.L. Doctorow at NYU, and he did something similar. He wrote Ragtime, and Ragtime, is maybe the first historical novel where he took real characters and mixed them in, but he didn't make them the stars of the show. And it's funny. The only book I didn't do that for was my book More Than It Hurts You, which is about Munchausen by proxy. But that book really was the most sort of ripped from the headlines. It dealt with race and.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I always do sort of want to delve into more than just an individual story, even though I think the individual story is the most important part. And it's funny you mentioned, I didn't put it together with my memoir, but yeah, my memoir was sort of digging through this painful thing that happened to me and trying to make sense of it. I don't know, do you ever know why you write what you write? I never know until I'm done. And even then, sometimes I don't know.
It's something I think more about now because I'm like, wait, haven't I already written about that? And sometimes it's, haven't I already written about that in nonfiction? Haven't I already written about that in fiction? Yeah. But I was having a conversation with my brother, actually, who's also a writer. A couple of years ago, I was interviewing him, and we both sort of had this realization about the things that we had been writing about all of our lives that we'd never really realized. And I realized every single book I've written, all 16 books or whatever, every single book is about someone whose identity changes or they pretend to be someone else. Yeah. And I was like,
that takes me too, for some reason. I always come back to that too.
Why have I been paying someone $30 every week when my brother could just tell me what's wrong with me?
Maybe the problem is you're only spending $30 a week. If you get it, you got to get a better class of shrink. You
might be right. You might be right.
But it's embarrassing when you realize it, because I felt the whole time I'm writing this book, I thought, wow, this is such a new thing for me. I'm mixing memoir and history and my family and contemporary and historical. And then when it was done, I was like, oh yeah, it's kind of like Chang and Eng. And people have pointed out to me, I just didn't, as you're writing it, I think you have to sort of blind yourself to what you're doing. I don't know if this is true for you too, where you just think, oh, this is totally new, unlike anything I've done before. And then when you finish it, you figure out, oh yeah, it fits into my other stuff.
Right. Well, and I think, in reading this book, and then thinking about your other books, stylistically, it's more closely related to Chang and Eng than your other books, and just sort of in the voice. But I was fascinated by your ability to sort of write a book that is slightly above the characters' heads, if that makes sense. Your narrative voice is omniscient, but it's not super omniscient. It's like close omniscient third person. And then to dig into your grandfather, but also dig into Lucille Ball at the same time, while using devices that we know from television, basically. And so I'm sort of curious, how did you decide how you were going to physically write the voice of the book?
It took me a long time, I think, because I just couldn't get it right for a long time. And in fact, the book is 309 pages now, but it was 650 pages when I handed it in. There was a whole different storyline.
Oh my God.
So the book now, is, the story of my grandfather, the story of Lucille Ball, and running through it very slightly in a very small storyline is me. 11 pages of the 309 is just a contemporary story of someone who's me talking about my grandfather. That was an entire storyline with subplot and characters and a murder mystery, actually. And it just didn't, no, I shouldn't say murder mystery, a mystery that anyway, so that all went. And then it was really only when that went that I sort of figured out the architecture of the book. And then I thought, yeah, it's about TV, so I should have some TV stuff in there. So there's a couple of times where it says cut to, and I just wanted to have fun with it. I don't know. Yeah, I think it's important to sort of at least convince yourself you're doing something new each time, even if you're not. And so the small ways I did that was by futzing with the voice and the structure.
Mm-hmm. But you also do a very cool thing, and we're not going to reveal all the story, viewers, because I know a lot of you probably have not read the book yet. And if you haven't, by the way, there's a link in the chat to the bookstore Mystery Inc., our fantastic independent bookstore, where she's got the book on sale for you, and she'll send it to you right away.
Oh, okay.
So we won't reveal any of the darkest secrets here, but there's a point towards about a third of the way through the book where you actually take us into the pilot episode of I Love Lucy. And you go through the whole episode, but you're also inside Lucille Ball's head at the same time. You're dealing with her emotions, going through all of that. It's, it's a real postmodern thing that you're doing in the writing, but it's also for me as a reader, like, it's the closest I've ever come when reading something to understanding what it must be like to be an actor. Like, where you're in a moment and you realize you're out of the moment, you're in your head, you're doing this, you're doing that. What was the process for coming up with that? And were you confident that it was true to how these people actually are, actors themselves?
I wasn't confident. I really just wanted to, examine Lucy. I just, so Lucille Ball is so cool. And I feel like we don't realize how cool she was nowadays. I mean, her popularity is sort of understood, but even that's hard to fathom. So she was so popular, and I've told the story a bunch, but forgive me for repeating it. She was so popular that her show, when her show cut to commercial, in all the big cities, and this was measured in New York, Detroit, Boston, the water table would drop because the entire city was going to the bathroom at the same time. Wow. Like, everyone would run to the bathroom, flush the toilet, and go back to watch her. So every week, her show had the equivalent of 85 million viewers. That's an average week.
Wow.
And, a big show nowadays is 8 million. So it's 10 and a half times, bigger than anything we have now. But beyond that, she was a mogul. The only reason Star Trek exists is because she greenlit that show. She was sort of proto-feminist, and the only reason that we had this interracial marriage on TV was because she pushed CBS to do it. They said, we're not going to have a Cuban guy married to a white woman, and she really fought hard for that. So I thought she was really cool. And once I decided to write about her, I thought, I gotta get into her head. And the only reason to tell the story, I guess, and sorry for the long-winded answer, but I read a bunch of biographies of her, and they were all super dry, because when you write a biography, if the person you're writing about is sort of withholding, then you'll never get beyond those kind of number facts, like 85 million viewers. So I thought, well, the only justification to do this is if I sort of give the sense of the texture of her life, what it's like to be the most famous woman in America. So I really had to just go for it and dive in. And I did some research. I read some books about actresses too, but I showed it to actor friends, and they said it was right. So that's sort of my method for everything. I don't know if you do that. I'll just take a stab at something and I'll show it to people who would know. Like, I mentioned my book, More Than It Hurts You. I wrote one of the protagonists is an African-American woman, and I wrote the whole book. And then I thought I should show it to some African-American women I know to make sure I'm not embarrassing myself, So that's what I did here with actors.
How many conjoined twins read Chang and Ang before it?
Not before, but after. I actually heard from a set of conjoined twins. That was like the proudest moment of my writing life. I heard from conjoined twin women who thought it was really good.
Well, that's a good sign. That's a very good sign.
See, there's a question here from someone who's like, Carol Grant, who said, "We need an explanation of why you were late." And I don't really have it, except for I'm just a freaking idiot. I'm so embarrassed and so sorry. I just forgot the time change and went out and was outside with my kids. And I thought, oh shit, I got the time wrong. And I ran all the way back. So I just have no excuse, but an apology.
I accept your apology, and Carol, I'm sure, does as well. We have all made the mistake of not understanding time.
And the thing is, I was so glad to do this. You're so nice to host me, Todd. You know, I asked you if I could do this, so I feel like it.
Okay, it's all right. Don't worry.
Okay.
Carol doesn't forgive you, but I do, and I'm the only person that is important here.
Okay, good. No, she said I'm excused. Okay, good.
All right, very well. So going back to Lucy herself, it doesn't seem like for today's world that a lot of people, you know, obviously younger than about our age. So I'm 49. I think you're about my same age. Like, she was a real part of my life because every day I'd come home from school and I would watch I Love Lucy and then Lost in Space and then The Monkees. And then my mom would not make dinner, and then we'd have Stouffer's chicken, and then I'd go to bed crying.
That's Lucy's fault, man.
Yeah, it might be Lucy's fault. But I know all the episodes. You know, every time I see a conveyor belt, I'm immediately watching I Love Lucy. But there's a stop point, presumably, in popular culture where she stopped being as well known. Were you concerned when you're writing about someone like that was the most famous person on earth, but who for the majority of the culture now is from antiquity, that there'd still be the interest in her?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I mean, I just had sort of faith that the story was good and she was a compelling person, but that's a great point. But, you know, if you think about it, you and I were born, you know, exactly the same time. And that's like 11 years after her show was done. So even though she was not a part of our direct lives, she just resonated. And so I felt like even people who didn't know who she was would have some inkling of, I mean, the name would be familiar.
Right.
And I thought she was such a cool figure that if I just told the story, it would be compelling.
Mm-hmm.
I really wanted it to stand on its own as a novel, and I wanted it to work whether or not you knew who she was. I wanted it to be a love story that was complex and interesting. I mean, I was really influenced by Love in the Time of Cholera.
Right.
Where you don't know, it's an obsession and you don't even know if it's real, if the obsession is real or healthy or what. And I feel like there's something about love that's like that. Not your marriage. I see on Facebook you seem to have an amazing wife, but for everybody else.
But you know, the other thing that I was thinking about as I read the book, in a weird way, is like a movie like Notting Hill, right? Where really it doesn't matter who the character is that's being played. That, you know, that is what's her name?
Julia Roberts.
Julia Roberts, yeah. Like, that's Julia Roberts, no matter what her name is in the movie. And what we want is to know that this person who is an otherworldly being to us has the same wants and needs and fears and desires, and as a corollary, might find us moderately attractive.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great point. So I think I really wanted to examine, and that's why I started with Trump, how damaging fame is in our culture, and how weird it is that we treat celebrities like that, and how weird it must be to be such a celebrity. So I think you're right. It doesn't necessarily matter. Like that, if Notting Hill was about the actual Julia Roberts or this Julia Roberts stand-in, it doesn't matter because it's just an examination of fame.
Right.
Yeah.
When you write about your grandfather, you know, like, let me just say for the record, in case any of my relatives are in the audience, the idea of writing a sex scene starring my grandfather is so far outside of the possibility of what I could do. Like, I can kill hundreds of people in a book. If you ask me to write a sex scene with my grandfather, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So
And it was pretty raunchy too.
it was a raunchy sex scene. So where do you have to go as a writer? Like, I mean, here's what I've always admired about you, Darin, and this is also for the audience, is that you go all the way in. You know, you didn't have to write your memoir Half a Life, and you did, you know, and you examined this horrible thing that happened, and you went bone marrow deep into it. And so if you hadn't done that in this book, I would have been surprised. But that being said, your poor Bubby.
He had a great time. Are you kidding? That's the best time he's had since he's died. No,
Talk a little bit about this. You know, I mean, there's one thing to examine your grandfather, a person that is in some way, of course, unknowable to you. You know, you only know a relative like a grandparent, you know, to the extent that they want you to know them, right? So you're imagining his life, but then you're imagining what a fantasy life of his would be. And that's got to be an artistic challenge.
I think, yeah, you know, I just feel like once you go, it's like you said, and it's very kind of you to say that about my stuff. I feel like once you decide to do it, you have to do it or it's not worth it. So I wasn't ready to write that memoir for years. And then when I was ready to do it, I thought, okay, I have to go deep or it's not worth it. So, but then, you know, once I made my grandfather my character, I just felt like, okay, he's my character at this point. And so I just gave him a sex scene and I just tried to imagine it as him. You know, it was weird. Again, it's one of those things that's only weird in retrospect. I wrote it and then I looked back and thought, oh, that's weird. But the funny thing is, so you and I met at this writers conference in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a for those in the audience, it's a great thing. You guys should all sign up. It's called the Sanibel Writers Conference. But it's often, since it's in Florida, there's often a lot of older people there. So I guess 2-3 years ago, I just written that sex scene and I thought I'll read it at this event. And this older woman said, I'm a big Lucille Ball fan. I heard you're going to read about Lucille Ball. And I said, yeah. I should have said, yeah, I'm going to read about my grandfather going down on Lucille Ball. Check it out. But I didn't say that. And so she said, I'm really excited to hear it. And you know, I would imagine it's always disruptive if someone storms out of a reading, but when someone storms out in a walker, it was the most disruptive thing imaginable. So
a walker on a hardwood floor, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. It was evident when this kind woman walked out because it was slow and it was loud.
So yeah, so you know, but again, I think I wanted the book to be entertaining. You know, I don't know. I read an essay recently by George Saunders where he said, whatever else you want to examine in a book, if it's not entertaining, you're not going to get there. So you know. I mean, I didn't write the sex scene to be titillating, but I felt like if you're going to have a romance in a book, you have, you know, an illicit romance, you have to have a sex scene of some kind. And then if you decide to do it, I think you have to do it. So yeah, it was weird. And, you know, it's been weird for my family. My dad and my mom have read it. My uncle read it. And, you know, I think you mentioned this the first question. I think my family's kind of pissed at me. You know, I wrote something about my uncle. And I said in the book, at the end of the book, that it wasn't true, but I think, you know, pretty mad. I said, my Uncle Arthur was the slower one. And, you know, and then in the end, afterward, I said, actually, my Uncle Arthur's a brilliant lawyer and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, I don't know. I think.
It's hard to unring that bell.
Yeah. There's a Yiddish saying, a family is doomed when a writer is born into it. And I think there's something to that.
Well, there's also a saying in the Talmud that if a man comes to kill you, wake up early and kill him first.
Right. I got to move and get a plug. Sorry, but yes, I think that
Uncle Arthur might be thinking that specifically about you at the moment.
yeah. It's, you know, I don't know. You've written nonfiction. Did you get in trouble when you did that?
You know, the nonfiction that I wrote when my mother was still alive, I would get in some trouble from her, but my response was always the same thing, which was that if you didn't want me to write about the terrible things that you did, you shouldn't have been terrible to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. That never seemed to satisfy her.
But, you know, so.
Never an answer your mother, it's not the answer your mother wants to hear, certainly. But I do recall for a while, I was a columnist for a newspaper in Las Vegas, and my weekly column would just be me talking about whatever was on my mind at the time. And a lot of times I would write about crazy things about my mother because she had moved in next door to me.
Right.
And one night I came home and she was still next door to me and the light was on in her house. And I was like, well, she's up awfully late. And I get home and she had emailed me links to all these columns, like that I was unaware that I had written them. And she's like, I didn't know you were talking about me in November of 2004. And I was like, well, I wasn't hiding it. It was in a national newspaper.
Yeah.
So, Didion always said, we're always selling somebody out. But they shouldn't be bad to us. I think that's the key.
Yeah, my grandfather wasn't bad to me. It was my grandmother and the rest of my family that he was bad to.
Right.
And one of the reasons I was so fascinated by him is that everyone forgave him, always. Like, he abandoned my grandmother. My grandmother's an alcoholic, and he left her. And for the last 30 years of his life, he lived with her best friend, and that was like his common law wife. And she always just talked about him as her husband. One of the saddest things I ever saw in real life was when, right before my grandmother died, I was at her hospice, and she was talking to the nurse about her husband. And I knew, and everyone else around knew, that her husband hadn't been her husband for 30 years, but she just forgave him. And my father too. My grandfather had sort of run a business into the ground, and my father was in that field, and he never offered anything to my dad, and yet my dad totally forgave him. So I just feel like there's a lot of unresolved stuff that we work through in writing.
Right.
Like you said, if you get the $30 shrink, then you gotta work it out on the page.
But it also seems like from the way that you wrote your grandfather that that he was charming, and there's something about charm, right? We're just going to fill your ears up, audience, with old Yiddish aphorisms. But there's a saying about charm that it makes both you and the other person feel pretty great about you, and
that's a good one.
And that seems that it's a part of the book that comes out. There's a wonderful moment in the book. It's wonderful and it's painful. When your grandfather and Lucille Ball are together for a tryst in Los Angeles, and they're talking about your grandmother. And it's weird, by the way, to talk about this as though these are things that have happened. But Lucille Ball asks him about her and about the relationship and what he would do if she were ill and all sorts of stuff. And you see the care and the concern that obviously you felt from your grandfather in your prose, but it's also sort of a fantasy version, it seems like, of what you'd hoped he would be. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I mean, I think in a way I made him worse than he was, because I don't know for sure that he was a cheater. I mean, I think he probably was, but I don't know when it started. I mean, there's a great quote, since we should move it now to non-Yiddish quotes. Amy Hempel has a great quote where she says, devil on the page, angel to the reader. And so right. I think that the worse I sort of made him, the more people have related to him. And I actually think it's true for me too. I felt sort of closer to him in writing the book than I had in a while, because even though I wrote him in all his flaws, I just, we're all sort of flawed, and I just sort of felt, just inhabiting him, I sort of felt closer to him. But it's funny too, in writing it, like I sort of bought all the family myths. Like the family myth was like, he didn't cheat on grandma, he left her and then started dating her best friend. And it's only when my wife came into the picture, she was like, that's not true, right? I just, a lot of it is sort of unpacking the myths.
This is one of the wonderful parts about having a wife, because I get a lot of that as well. It's like it's worse for me because she's like, you write detective fiction and you have absolutely no perceptive abilities whatsoever.
Yeah, like, I once said something about this James quote about, a writer is someone on whom nothing is lost, and my wife was like, yeah, do you know how often you lose things? So yeah.
Well, I've got just a couple more questions for you, and then we're gonna turn it over to the audience. I know the audience had a bunch of questions before. If they have more questions, you can put them in the Q&A, or you can put them in the chat, and we'll pull them up, and we'll ask Darin to answer them. So just one sort of technical thing about the writing of the book that I know people are curious about is, what's the legal ramifications of writing about someone like Lucille Ball, particularly when she has living heirs? And I know there's a bunch of comments going on in the chat. Her daughter, in fact, lives here in the desert, Lucy Arnaz. Is there a legal side, or is there an ethical side, or is there a moral side? What goes into that thought process for you?
That's a good question. I think that, well, there are two things. One is the ethics and one is the legality. I think there were very few things that Random House asked me to change. They did ask me to change a couple of things, and it was about the kids. Because her son had a drug problem, and I talked about that, and they said, maybe just lay off that. So I did. I didn't really change the book in any serious way. But, when you write about a public figure, and when you say it's fiction, you have a lot of latitude. So I didn't have to get permission. If you write a nonfiction book about a non-famous person, then you have to get all kinds of life rights and stuff. But I was very clear that it was fiction. And so I didn't have to worry about that. And morally, I think there's something similar there. Like, we live in an age of fake news. So, you are aware of people lying in print all the time.
Right.
But I think there's different rules when you write fiction. And it's even different in a film, I think. Like, I was very angry at the movie JFK, even though it was not purporting to be a documentary. I just felt like it was irresponsible because it was making these claims about what happened. But
Right.
That was, I think, because Oliver Stone was saying, well, I figured out what happened in this. I've solved the JFK murder, whereas I'm not saying my grandfather actually had this hot sex with Lucille Ball. So I think you have to give creative writers freedom to be creative. Like it goes back to Shakespeare and Julius Caesar. Like he made up that whole story, based on truth. And Napoleon is in War and Peace. And I think, we're better, the culture is better because those things exist.
Right. And, I think the problem happens in fiction when people don't understand the difference between fiction and truth. So a book like The Help, for instance, I think does civil rights a disservice because it makes you think that actually happened.
Yeah.
And in fact, if those things had happened, those people would be dead. And so in that way, it sort of is civil rights porn, a book like The Help.
Yeah. It's the same thing with the Holocaust stuff,
Yeah, exactly. Like Inglourious Bastards. I can watch it and I can say, okay, that's an interesting Tarantino movie. But as a Jew, I think someone's going to watch this and believe this is true, you know? And I find that really challenging artistically, because I know that people are foolish, you know?
That movie really is interesting because I feel like that beginning when not to get too deep into it if you guys haven't seen it, but there's the opening scene where the Nazi is he finds the French guy who's hiding the Jews in the floor. And to me, that is one of the great Holocaust scenes in any film and shows what a great talent he is, Tarantino. But then it's really irresponsible, you're right, because then at the end he kills, Hitler is killed by, these Jewish soldiers and this Jewish this movie theater owner. And it's just, I don't know, it seems really irresponsible to take something. So same thing with Django Unchained, great. It could have been one of the great Civil War movies, but then it becomes
a Tarantino movie.
Yeah, it becomes a comedy. It really pisses me off in a way because I love his talent, and I think that those two movies especially are really good in a lot of ways. But so I didn't want to do that.
It's an interesting question because I think too that, obviously your book also sort of has that great afterword, right? A disclaimer. that saves your uncle's reputation. But the reality of the relationships and the reality of Lucille Ball in Hollywood, you're very faithful to the truth. You make up a relationship with your grandfather, but I don't think there's ever a moment as a reader where I was like, well, this must be a true story. But I want to make that leap too. And I think that's an interesting part when you're writing about a real person is, oh, like I want to imagine myself in this world. I want to be in that scene with Desi and Lucy. Like I want to be there in 1953. Like, what's that like? And you convey that so well. And that's a testament to, obviously, to your talent, but also to your research. And I just found it all, extraordinarily compelling, other than your grandfather having sex like that.
That was weird, yeah. But no, thank you, Todd. And that's the thing that I hadn't thought of. But in the reviews, people have said, like, two reviews said, I really wish this was true, which I hadn't thought would happen. And that is, I don't know, you must find that too when you write. Like, to you, they're your characters and you're playing a game and you're doing it on the page. And then to the reader, they're these real people. And so
right,
when you write a murder, it's just fun and games for you. But for people reading it, it's like, oh my God.
Yeah. I do have a list of people I'd like dead. Well, let's get to the questions from the audience. We're going to bring back on board Agam Patel. And if you don't know Agam Darin, when you turn your computer onto your email, you're going to get about 30 emails from him.
Hey, Darin.
Forgive me again for my...
No problem. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming out and joining us.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah.
What do we have, Mr. Patel?
Yeah, so we've got a first question here. It says, do we get to see a fictional book about Trump next?
No.
Not necessarily about Darin's book, but it's a question nonetheless.
I think we've got enough real-life Trump to last us for a while. Like, I don't want to read any more about him.
Yeah.
One of the things that's been nice about the book, I feel like, is time. I mean, it's a terrible time to put anything out in the world, I think. But people have said, who have liked the book, have said, well, it's nice to have something totally different from this world. And I think it's just so depressing to read everything right now. You guys obviously are dealing with fires on top of everything else. So I just think, no more Trump. Like,
yeah.
Hopefully November will be the last we ever have to think about it.
Well, I think the interesting thing about entertainment during this time where we've all been stuck in our homes is you have to make the conscious effort to escape whatever chaos it is. And there's a different chaos every single day. And I found great comfort in literature in the last 6 months, to have that quiet time where my brain is turned off and I can imagine another life. And so even, just rereading your book, Darin, before this, because I'd read it, 2 months ago or whatever it was, just to be in another world for 45 minutes. So viewers, if you aren't big readers and you just like these conversations because it's fun to hear us talk, I try to spend 45 minutes of every single day reading. Mm-hmm. And it calms my mind in a way that I can get some work done. But also it reminds me that there's an other side, an other side to everything, that there's a history in the things that we write about, and that those people got through something too, even if it's something that's made up. A good question. What else you got?
All right, Darin, is your family part of the Abram and Strauss department store in New York?
No. So what happened was and I talk about it in the book a little bit, my great-grandfather was from Russia, and there was an anti-Semitic pogrom where he lived, and so he escaped and came to America, and his brother was supposed to meet him at Ellis Island and didn't show up. So my great-grandfather at 13 with no English and no money walked into New York City, and then 20 years later walked out a rich man. Somehow he had sort of built this real estate empire. And then I said that my grandfather had this incredible rare skill of being able somehow to inherit a bunch of Manhattan skyrises and still lose everything. It's impossible to lose money when you inherit real estate in New York. But somehow by the time I came around, my grandfather was broke. And so he was not, we had no claim on A&S or Abraham and Strauss. And somehow, many times over, I feel like my family was almost rich, and yet no.
What about Levi?
In fact, my dad lost his house to the bank when I
Oh
was
my gosh.
a kid. So yeah, no.
Oh my gosh. Gum, did you see the question about the film adaptations? Do you see that one? It's a good one.
I did not.
I will ask it. This comes from Michelle Raphael, who's a fantastic writer and editor here in Southern California. Darin, do you think we'll see screen versions of your books?
Hello, Michelle. Good to see you. I know her, and I'm a fan of hers. I would like that. There's an Aaron Sorkin Lucille Ball project that's kicking around. So I think that's sort of a hurdle, but it's such a different story, and I don't know. I'm optimistic. People in LA who have read it have said they were skeptical, but they really liked the story. So we'll see. Knock on wood. It's always a crapshoot, as everyone knows.
There was that book about the movie about that affair that Marilyn Monroe has with Eddie Redmayne.
Yes. It's a weird one.
So personally, this is just not related to your work, but I have a moratorium on seeing movies with Eddie Redmayne in them. It's lasted 7 years at this point.
What was the one that you saw that turned you off?
Les Mis.
Yeah.
Les Mis was the last one that we saw, and I was like, no more Eddie Redmayne. Or maybe it was no, actually I lied to you. It's the one where he's Stephen Hawking. That was the last one that I saw.
I'm not a fan unless he's watching, and then if you want to option it.
Unless he wants to option your work, then he is. But it seems to me, particularly this one, is ripe for it. It seems like a prestige cable channel would see a limited series 8-episode show on this, and who wouldn't want to play Lucille Ball?
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. I mean, so a friend of a friend is the manager of Emma Stone, so we got it to her. We'll see what happens.
Oh, she would be great.
Would she be good? Yeah.
Yeah, she would be great, and I would be great as your grandfather.
Yeah. Well, with all your acting experience.
Don't you just need to be a swarthy Jewish person in this role? I'm prepared.
Yeah. 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 There's the resemblance. Yeah, no, I definitely. I mean, I find you very charismatic. So if you want a screen test,
I'll have my people contact your people. All right, again, what else do we have? Other questions?
Wait, I want to ask you a question, Todd.
Sure.
Do you read your audiobooks?
No, I have a badass guy named Johnny Heller who reads my books.
Okay, because I
great.
could see you doing a really good job with it.
I would vamp it up too much. Johnny's great because he makes everything I say sound super dangerous. And the weird thing now is when I'm writing, I hear his voice in my head.
Oh, wow.
As the dialogue.
It happened to me once. So speaking of movies, it never got made, but I wrote a screenplay with Gary Oldman for Chang and Eng.
Mm-hmm.
And then we became friends. And so for my website, which is now down for some reason, I have to get a new one. He read from my book, More Than Hurts You. He read a section, and he just made it so much better, Like when an actor can take mediocre words and make them great, it's just so cool.
It's the history of television.
Yeah. Although too often it's the opposite. It's great words being made mediocre.
Right. But Gary Oldman could read the phone book and you'd be like, yeah, the Smiths have some problems.
Yeah, the Smiths are dark, man.
Yeah. All right, what you got, Agam?
All right, what projects are you currently working on? What are you working on? What are you writing? What do you have in the pipeline?
So the memoir that Todd was very kind about, both here and elsewhere. Todd's always been really nice about that book. I'm writing a screenplay for it, so we'll see.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a great Australian director named Josh Wakely who now lives in LA who optioned it, so we're working together on it.
Oh wow. I mean, this is an unusual experience because you first did it as This American Life, then you wrote the book, now you're doing the screenplay. Is the graphic novel would be next. Like to go over this thing, you know, this terrible thing that happened, and keep having to take yourself back to it. How hard is that?
Yeah, I should say what it's about. It's so I don't know if you talked about this in the period where I
Yeah.
on, but so I was driving my car in high school, and this girl committed suicide by swerving her bicycle in front of me, and I hit her, and she died. And it's very painful always to talk about and go over. But only in writing the book did I gain a real visceral understanding of the power of AA. Because I think, you know, AA is about getting in front of a group of strangers and talking about something that you don't want to talk about.
Right.
So it's very tough, and then I always feel a little better afterwards. So it's been interesting. I told the director, if it gets made, I don't think I could watch it, which would be sort of a bummer if someone's actually like playing me and I'm in it, you know, like I'd like to see that Brad Pitt, you know.
And Liam Hemsworth.
Exactly. Yeah, you'd have to, you know, keep the bodybuilding going. But yeah, it's tough. But you know, you as you said, you've written painful stuff. How do you feel like when you would write painful things about your past? How did it make you feel worse or better afterward?
You know, in the process of writing it, it made it feel like you're back in the moment. You know, I mean, and trauma has a way of doing that to you, right? Like when your brain doesn't know the difference between now and then when you're reliving trauma most of the time.
Yeah.
But like there was an essay I wrote several years ago called When They Let Them Bleed, about seeing a boxer die.
Yeah.
And you know, I get emails about this all the time but it's really about being there when my mom died. You know, it's an essay about one thing that's really about another thing. And you know, what I have always found is that the process of talking about it with someone else who has used that piece of work to deal with something of their own, that's cathartic. That's the part where I don't feel isolated in my sadness anymore, where I feel like, you know, I'm part of something larger than myself. It's also sort of what I've always appreciated about Half a Life is that book, even though it's about this girl dying, for me, when I read it, it was about a lot of other things. It was about the thing I was going through in my head at that time, about the people that I had lost and the regrets that I had. And so I think with great art, you always attach your own emotion to it. And whatever it helps you go through or helps you solve in that time, it becomes more important in that way. But I remember hearing you do that on This American Life and being in the car and being like, well, now I'm sobbing and I have to go to work. You know? It's like, I have to go have my life.
Because I felt like that was going to be a small book for people who had dealt with accident stuff. But like you said, I think grief is so universal and guilt is so universal. I realized that was the most universal thing I think I wrote, because so many people feel guilty about stuff they're not culpable for. So like all the stuff that, like I knew intellectually, yeah, she was committing suicide. I wasn't to blame, but I was totally wrecked by guilt forever, you know? And I think that's a sort of common thing where you know you didn't do anything wrong, but you still feel bad.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly the thing about that book that I was experiencing at that time, is I was feeling guilt for this relationship that I had with my mother before she died, that I felt guilty about, but it wasn't my fault, you know? But that's the thing about, you know, great writing, Darin, and that's why I think your voice is valuable, particularly at this time in people's lives, if they go and read that book or anything that you write about, is that you always show great empathy in what you're writing about, for the suffering of others, you know? And I think that's an important thing that people forget about when they're at home by themselves, you know, isolated. But in all your books, that's something that has shown that, which I think is hard to do.
That means a lot coming from you. Thank you.
Of course.
And someone said, have I been creative during the pandemic? Not really. It's really a tough time, you know?
Yeah. I've been surprisingly creative, but only because I didn't want to have to give the money back.
That's right. You handed something in, you said, right?
Yeah, I had to turn something in. I had to turn a couple things in. But the pandemic's over, so there's nothing to worry about. Everything's fine now.
Yeah, rear view.
Yeah. Are there any more questions, Agon, before we let Darin go back to his life?
I think that was the last one.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks again to everybody, and thank you for sticking around. And it was such a pleasure. So thank you.
Of course.